Good morning. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you're having a fabulous day already. I'm excited to be here. It's episode 118, and I'm excited, a little bit excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today. And as often happens, this is going to be a mindset issue. When I started Wellness Wednesday, it was on my heart for a long time to do it. And I started it because I have been on a lifelong journey with anxiety and depression, negative maladaptive thinking. As I grew, I realized, number one, how much tips from others had come into play, even if I wasn't willing to listen to them at the time, and how much sharing my journey helped both me and others, as well as listening to others share theirs. That's kind of the premise behind peer support and support groups is sharing life experiences and tips. So that's why I started Wellness Wednesday. So if you're just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna, and I encourage you as we go to say hi and to ask questions or make comments. And Facebook doesn't always show me those while I'm on. So if I will acknowledge you if I see it. And I will answer questions and make and comments if I see them. But if not, then I will after I'm done with the live, because not always does the technology cooperate. So I just promise that if I don't acknowledge you or I don't respond, then it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's just because it wasn't shown to me while I was on live. Again, if you're just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a girlfriend, a wellness advocate. I love to run, jazzercise, line dance, and I have my own online activewear boutique, and I'm studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, which is teaching me even more as I go. In any case, I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you enjoyed last week's video on choosing the power of choice, choosing for others. It was kind of an unintended 4-part series about choices. Choosing to move, choosing for ourselves, choosing better food options, and then choosing for others. And if you didn't see that video and you want to, I will drop the link in the comments later when I'm done. But today we're going to touch on a topic that's been on my list for a hot minute, and it has to do with going home, proverbially speaking. It has to do with growth and what happens after we've experienced it. And the quote that inspired this was, "A mind that is stretched by new experience can never go back to its old dimensions," by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I found that the first time I stumbled upon that quote, I found it profound. It was something I stumbled on a long time ago, and it made a lot of sense to me at that time, and even more so now. So when we talk about going home, it just told me before I got on that live reactions weren't available anymore, but there's my thumb. So this is less about physical places and more about the inability to return to past versions of ourselves or how we once experienced the world. And I'm hoping as I talk here that you're going to recognize moments like this in your life. But let's get going. So growth and change. Experiences, growth, and learning change our perspectives and make us view familiar things differently. But it also opens us up to new things that we didn't experience. So a lot of my growth as an adult really started around the downturn, around the construction downturn. I was working for the local Home Builders Association. Good morning, Miss Carla. And the downturn affected us in such a manner that I had to become the only staff person and go to part-time. And for the first time in my life, I was looking for ways to make differences so that if that downturn continued for a prolonged period of time, or for some reason, it was the first time that I really doubted whether or not I would be able to find employment, really. And so I started looking at going back to school, and it was an idea that kind of morphed a little suddenly. I never saw myself going to college. I quit high school in the middle of my senior year. I got my GED a year later. I started working. And I grew up in that era where we were taught that if we worked at a job for a long time and we were faithful to it, and we were and we brought our work ethic to the table, and we were patient, that we would reap huge rewards. And unfortunately, even then, we had come into a time where that wasn't necessarily the case anymore. So for the first time in my life, I thought about going to school, and that's what I ended up doing to fill in those gaps around that part-time employment, so that I could make at least a lateral move later if I needed to, because at the time, the degree or work experience equivalent had disappeared from job applications, and instead it was that you needed to have a degree of some sort regardless of your experience. So in that instance, I couldn't even make a lateral move to another job, another similar job, because I didn't have, even though I had the experience and I had great experience, I didn't have that piece of paper. So that's when I started looking at school, and I ended up enrolling to work on my AA. And then shortly afterwards, probably about 6 months, I think a little bit later, I think by the time that I made the infamous trip to New York that I said no to like 5 times, I think I was even maybe starting to work on my bachelor's degree at that point, because that was 2015. So yeah, I was working on my bachelor's. So my AA turned into my bachelor's. And as I started studying my first love, which was psychology, I started to learn and grow. Good morning, Miss Amanda. I started to learn things about myself. You know, there's an old joke that those of us that study psychology, we start doing that to fix ourselves. And I can't deny that. I mean, I wanted to learn more about the human brain. I wanted to learn more about how it worked, and why I reacted to things the way I did, and why I did things the way I did, and also why other people did. I wanted to have a better understanding of that. And so when I started school and I took my first psychology class during my AA, I realized and remembered quickly that that really was my first love in high school. And that's I ended up changing my major, and I ended up doing my Bachelor of Psychology. So, as I said, experiences and growth and learning opens us up to new things, either that we weren't willing to look at before, that we didn't notice before. So as time went forward, and if you've seen previous Wellness Wednesdays, you know I've talked about that friend that asked me to go to New York with them to help move somebody, all centered around a Scorpions concert in Canada. And I hadn't left the state in years. In fact, I had rarely left the state since I had been in Florida. And I moved back to Florida in 1990. So this New York trip was one of my first major stellar moments. Good morning, Miss Michelle, of saying yes. And I touched on that, I think, a couple of episodes ago. And then from there, here's what happens. And this is kind of what I'm talking about when I mean that once you experience growth in any fashion, it's hard to go backwards. So in making that trip, I didn't have to pay for my plane ticket, but I did learn that the plane ticket wasn't that expensive. Within the process of saying yes to that trip and executing that trip, I took a step way out of my comfort zone. I not only went out of town with friends, I went out of state with friends, I went out of the country, I got my passport so I could go to Canada. And I did things that up until that point I probably would have not done, not without some serious prodding, and just serious anxiety. So that was the beginning really of a full year of just complete transformation for me in terms of my mindset and how I thought, because that New York trip was kind of a catalyst. Oh, hey, I can do this. Oh, hey, it's not that expensive to travel, depending on where you're going and what you're doing. And oh, hey, you know what? I was able to take the time off work, and I was able to take this time for myself, and it worked out. And it was scary at first, but it worked. So that was a huge step for me. And once that happened, it was like, you know, you see those memes where the top of the person's head is open and just all kinds of colors, figures, whatever are coming out, depending on what the meme's about. If it's about mental health, or if it's about learning something new or transformation, there's the skull is open and there's just all this stuff coming out. And that's kind of what it felt like happened. So that trip was a catalyst for much more very shortly following. Very shortly following, I ended up ending a long-term relationship and then booking my first trip back to where I grew up. I hadn't been there in like 25 years. So much like visiting your hometown after years away, that often feels different. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here, not just in a physical sense, but in a proverbial sense too. So 25 years later, I went back to a place where I experienced a lot of emotional turmoil, and a lot of disconnect and a lot of feeling, what's the word I'm looking for? Feeling not included, feeling not part of. And I went back there because of what I was learning in my classes and because of that trip to New York and the steps that I was starting to take following that trip to New York, I went back with a different attitude. When I first booked the trip, I had a lot of trepidation. I was doing that thing where I was, trying to create scenarios in my head of what was going to happen when I ran into certain people or when I went certain places and how I was going to respond. And doing that, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about, that thing where we envision every possible scenario that we can think of and what it's going to look like and how it's going to start and what we're going to say and what we're going to do and all of those things. But at the time, I was also learning about mindfulness, and I was learning a new technique for my thinking that was helping me to arrest that kind of and learn to just kind of be in the moment. So I made that trip back to where I grew up for the first time in 25 years. And I went with an open mind, and I stopped myself every time that I would start to create those scenarios and try to predict what was going to happen and how I was going to respond to it and control it and all of those things. Good morning, Miss Patricia. Because of what I was learning in school, would stop that. And I would say, no, Donna, focus on what you're doing right now. Focus on what's happening right now. Worry about that later. And I would just say these little things to me to help get through that anxiety tirade that I was on. So by the time I actually made the trip and was in those situations, what I had learned changed my perspective completely. Almost nothing that I envisioned might happen when I was there happened. But so many good things happened, and I reconnected with so many people. And I ended up walking away from that trip with a completely different view of my childhood, of where I grew up, and of that experience. And it put a lot of old things, and I call it my trip to wrestle demons. And that trip was probably long overdue, but had it not been for school and that trip to New York, those saying yes to things that were out of my comfort zone, I don't know that I still would have made that trip back to Michigan. It was something that I had known I needed to do for a long time. And when I did it, I came away with a whole different experience and a whole new appreciation, not only for the things and events that shaped the person that I was, but that I was able to now put them in their place and move forward. So, in that year, this all kicked off an amazing year of transformation for me back in 2016 that really hasn't stopped. Sometimes I have moments, or months of stagnation. But for the most part, I still find myself to be in an ever-growing, ever-evolving situation, because now I've learned that doing that, learning, growing, and being open to new experiences takes me to new places, and it takes me to some of those proverbial places that I always wanted to go and never thought I could. So I don't want to go backwards, because that time and that transformation taught me to appreciate myself. It taught me to appreciate being in my own space with myself. And it taught me what I truly had to offer and what I was capable of, which meant that I started making better decisions going forward. I started making better decisions about who I spent my time with, what I did with my time, all of those things. And that I was capable of more, which gave me hope. So for obvious reasons, when I put all that into a little package and present it to you, you can see why, even though it was intense for me at moments, and painful and emotional, I would never want to go backwards and undo that process, because that process is why I'm studying for my master's now. It's why I'm standing here talking to you today, about wellness and about journeys and about things that we can do or things that we can embrace. So I certainly would never, ever go backwards. But sometimes we want to. Sometimes we want to go home because things get difficult and things get challenging, and we want to retreat to our comfort zone. And you know what I say about that. I learned a long time ago, and I had heard it for years, but I never truly understood it until I experienced it. Nothing grows in our comfort zones. They're fantastic. They're comfy. They're safe. Even if they are ugly situations, it's like the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know, right? So even if they're bad situations, there's still a familiarity there. We know how to navigate those. We know how to deal with those. We don't know how to deal with the unknown. So that's why change or stepping out of our comfort zone or growth can be scary, because it's safer, and our brain tells us it's safer to stay with what we know, even if we don't like it, even if we're not happy with it, right? So I would invite you to think about some experiences that you've had, some growth experiences that you've had that made old habits, relationships, places, whatever, feel weird and alien to you at the time, and how you feel about those things now. Because like Holmes's quote, once you've introduced new ideas, new skills, new perspectives to your world, old things feel limiting or unfit. They feel like once you've stretched your foot out there and dipped your toe elsewhere, everything just kind of feels different. And most of the time, this is good. If you're truly experiencing change, growth, learning, this is a good thing, even if it doesn't feel like it right away. So what are some experiences that made old habits or relationships or whatever is applicable here, fill in the blank, feel weird and alien to you at the time? And now you're like, oh, I'm so glad that happened. Like, if it weren't for the downturn and that wreaked havoc for a lot of people, including me, I don't know that I would have ever enrolled to do my AA, which means I wouldn't be here right now. So, this is why growth can feel uncomfortable. Sometimes it changes our relationships. Like-minded people versus new people is the note I have here. And what that means is when we're in our comfort zone, we usually surround ourselves with people who, we feel more advanced than or more evolved than because we feel like we're helping them, or people who are like-minded. Whereas when we start surrounding ourselves with new people that have different ideas, or maybe are doing things we want to do, or have personality traits that we want to be like, that's when we start stretching. That's when we start expanding. I've talked before about that friend of mine who was so positive all the time. And the more time I spent with them, the more I wanted to be around them. Because when I looked at them, I was like, how can they be just so positive about everything? And I wanted to be like that. And the more time I spent around this person, the more I started to believe that I could be like that. But that also made existing relationships difficult, because the relationship I was in at the time, the interaction and the dynamic there was very negative between the two of us. And as I began to embrace and understand and crave that positive interaction, those increasingly negative interactions that I was having in my relationship just became completely intolerable to me. Now, I won't blame it all on that person, because my mindset was changing, and I had been entrenched in a very negative mindset for years. And so I probably fed that. You see what I mean? It's those things are synergistic. So when we're in a certain type of relationship with a certain mindset, we feed the negativity or the volatility of that relationship. And then when we start reaching out or branching out, a lot of times that becomes intolerable. And that's what happened for me, was the more time I spent around this person, the less time I wanted to be around the negative influences in my life. I didn't recognize at the time, I do now, it was because I was feeding into those negative influences as much as they were feeding into me. So I was helping those negative situations to grow and to continue to become increasingly more negative. So sometimes we're afraid to grow because it is going to change your relationships with people. It is, because it's going to change you. It's going to change your values. It's going to change your priorities, and it's going to change your mindset. And so your relationships are going to look different. And that's why sometimes growth can be scary and uncomfortable and we don't want to do it because we're afraid of what might happen, good or bad. And again, it's because our priorities and values start to shift. Sometimes in those moments, we romanticize the past and we want to go home emotionally or mentally when we're faced with challenges. So I had a friend that used to refer to this as reverting to training. When we are stressed out, when we are facing challenges, when we're facing something scary, we revert to training. We revert to our old coping mechanisms. Just like a child, like my daughter, when she would get sick, she could be 14 years old and she'd get sick and Thumbelina or the Nutcracker Suite would be in the VCR. Yeah, I said VCR because we still had one. And she would regress to like 8 years of age. And that's normal when we're facing challenges, when we're not feeling well, either mentally, emotionally, or physically, that we tend to regress and we retreat into old familiar habits that we know helped us in those moments before, even if they're not helping us now. Good morning, Victoria. So comfort zones seem really appealing, but a lot of times they pull us backwards and they don't allow us to experience that continued growth. And believe me, I've been pulled backwards a few times. But the difference is now is I know I'm being pulled backwards and I know the signs and I know what that could lead to. And so I'm able to stop myself now and go, no, we don't want to go here. We don't want to go here. Because sometimes we are triggered to go backwards. Sometimes something happens that hasn't happened to us since we were in that old mindset, and in that old pattern of behavior. And so when it happens, it triggers us and we immediately retreat back to what we know because we go on autopilot or we go into fight or flight response. So when that happens, we often repeat a situation until we've truly learned or grown from it. And that's okay because again, once the knowledge is there, we're not going to repeat that same situation for as long. It might not be as intense. It might come to a head sooner because we can't undo that old knowledge. We can't undo that new knowledge. Good morning, Miss Megan. So, I experienced that in terms of adult bullying. I had a couple of different workplace bullies, if you will. And I learned a lot from the first one. And I even exited the job to get away from that person. And in the process of exiting the job, I got better at asking for what I was worth. I got better at a lot of things. But then several years later, I found myself in a very similar situation. And I sat down one day crying in my office and I said, how am I here again? How and why am I here again? Why am I experiencing again? And in a flash of a moment in my mind, the answer was because you didn't learn from the first time. And what I didn't learn was I didn't learn how to stand up for myself. I had exhibited it in other areas, but back in a similar situation, I was still not standing up for myself in the name of professionalism. I was still not drawing boundaries, and that was bleeding over into other parts of my life. And in order for me to move forward and stop experiencing these repeat scenarios, these groundhog days, if you will, I had to learn. I had to actually learn from what was going on. So, if we do find ourselves regressing or being pulled back by that reverting to training, and we find ourselves in our old comfort zones and we're like, wait a minute, I thought I was done with this. I thought I was past this. Rest assured that if we're actually paying attention and we're embracing the knowledge that we've learned, we will figure it out sooner rather than later. And we can stop repeating those situations simply by recognizing that new knowledge and saying, no, I'm not doing this again. Now, what do I need to do different? What did I learn to do different so that I can stop repeating this scenario? So basically, discomfort is a sign of progress. It means that you no longer fit in that comfortable area, which more than likely was maybe great in some ways, but had some bad aspects to it before. And it's a sign of progress. Butterflies can't go back to cocoons, y'all. Why would we shrink ourselves back into a less enlightened or smaller version of ourselves? We don't want to do that, right? Good morning, Danielle. So a lot of times this is because we're afraid to forget. We're afraid to let go. We're afraid to see the things we know change, our relationships, our jobs, our whatever. And we talk a lot about how we wish we didn't know now what we didn't know then, or I think that's a song. I know it's a song. Or we wish we would have known then what we know now. But what would you have done differently? In that moment, would you really have done anything differently? And how dramatically would it have changed who and where and what you are now? Because I got to be honest with you. I made a lot of bad choices. I made a lot of bad choices that were based in fear and negativity and the wrong mindset. But I personally wouldn't do anything different. Because where I've been has made me who I am today. Stepping out of those comfort zones or being knocked out of them or being catapulted out of them, whatever the situation may have been, being forced out of those comfort zones, really whether we make the choice to step out of the comfort zone or whether we're forced out of the comfort zone, which happens a lot, I wouldn't change a thing, because those situations are where I got that growth and where I got that learning, and what made me who I am today, and made it possible for me to learn to love and appreciate all of the parts of that person. And that's huge. And love and appreciate where I'm at in the moment. So how do we embrace this? You know, that's we're getting right into the feels there. And hopefully you don't feel like I'm talking in circles. This is one of those things that's going to kind of breed in your head all day, I think. So how do we embrace it? Well, we honor where we've been, but we put it in its place. So I had a relationship that was off and on for years. It was toxic. It was ugly. It was great in the beginning, but it was toxic. It was ugly. The person, the individual had a substance use problem, and it was not going to get better. It was just going to continue to get worse. That was evident. There was codependence, and there was, like I said, just toxicity back and forth all the time, on, off. We're together, we're not. We're together, we're not. 2:00 in the morning, knocking on the door. So it took me years to finally put that relationship in its place, which really happened. And this is why sometimes I say that year of transformation for me was like all of a sudden everything just clicked into place, but it wasn't that. It took me years to get to a point where one day I looked at that relationship and I said, I can't do this anymore. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to anybody else impacted. And that person that I fell in love with didn't exist anymore. And the person I was at that time didn't exist anymore either. And in that moment, after a long time of anger and bitterness and rumination, I was finally able to put that relationship where it belonged, which was in the past, and take those lessons and move forward, which taught me to start demanding better for myself in who I chose as a partner. And that shows in that time frame, not just that relationship, but a couple of previous, in that time frame, I would literally be introduced to a guy and a friend would be like, you should go after this guy. And I would sit in a bathroom stall and go, he's never going to like anybody like me. I'm not worthy of somebody like him. That was my mindset, y'all. That's how negative my mindset was. That I didn't think I was worth better. So once I started learning to put things in their proper place and take those lessons and move forward and started to change my thinking and experience that growth, I started demanding better for myself in my employment arena, in my personal life, in my relationships, not just the romantic ones, but all of them. And yes, those relationships changed because of that, but they changed for the better. So if you want to do this, I wish I would have known now, wish I didn't know now, whatever that looks like, would you do anything different? And how much would it have a drastic impact on the person you are today? Because if it was ugly, whatever it is that you're putting in its place, if it was ugly and you grew out of that, it gave you skills to move forward. It gave you different skills or different emotions or different coping mechanisms. So think hard about that before you decide that you would do something over. And even if you think you would, it may be time to just check that lesson here and then still put that in its place and wait until it's time to use that lesson on something else. Okay, so So how we embrace it is we honor where we've been and we put it in its place, in its appropriate place, which is usually back there. And we take the lessons off the top and we move forward with those. We practice mindfulness and gratitude for our current state, for where we are now, and how we are now and who we are now, because we know that we wouldn't be there without that experience, right? If we like the person we are, if we're in the process of tumultuous change, we have to know that it's going to come out better on the other side. We appreciate the differences. We appreciate the differences between ourselves now and ourselves then. What have we learned? How are we better? What does it look like? I can remember a time where financially I never thought I was going to get through the week. And then years later, I could get through the week, but I was worried about months and years financially instead of the week. And I had to often stop and go, whoa, Donna, think about where you were 5 years ago. Something like what just happened with the car would have broken you. It would have put you behind for weeks. And now it's an extra charge on a credit card you have to pay off. You know what I mean? Not that I recommend putting things on credit cards, but you get my drift. As you grow and as you have new experiences, your thought process has changed. But it's also important for us to be like, okay, where are we now compared to where we were? And be grateful and mindful of that current state, and appreciate the differences. Surround yourself with people that inspire you and challenge you. Because if you're thinking about those people and you're like, man, I wish I could be more like that, or they're doing what I wish I could do, and I've never felt like I could do it, but they're doing it. Those are the people that are challenging you. They're challenging the status quo. They are challenging your comfort zone in a positive way. Just like that friend who was positive all the time, and I would find myself as I'm getting on a little rant about something, I wish I could be more like this person. It was in an admiration sense, not a jealousy sense. So that's important. So surround yourself with people that you admire, with people that inspire you and challenge you, because that is what's going to cultivate that continued embracing of growth and challenge. And then I would encourage you to reflect again. I personally can't think of a single time that I didn't come out of a bad situation better off, or in some way. You know what I mean? Like the downturn. The downturn could have been ugly for me if I hadn't gotten a little proactive. But I came out of it with a degree. And then I kind of put that on hold, went back to pattern for a while, and then ended up, now I'm pursuing my degree. So I can't think of anything bad that's happened to me that hasn't resulted in a better person, a better skill, a better experience, or just having kind of lifted me to the next level. So I would challenge you to think about that and think about if there's been anything that you haven't learned a little lesson from. And we've talked about this before in terms of finding the silver lining or finding something to be grateful for in every negative situation. So my challenge to you in the next week to wrap this up is, what have you outgrown? And how can you celebrate that growth today? Think of one thing that you have outgrown and find a way to celebrate that growth today and embrace it and figure out what the next step is. Okay? So I want you to remember these things before I finish up. It's not about moving on. It's about moving forward. So moving on is scary. Moving on implies we're leaving everything. Everything's changing. We can't go backwards, and that's a scary premise. If we move forward, which is exciting, and we look forward to what the future holds, we'll often find we don't want to go backwards, and that not being able to is not as scary anymore because we've made the choice to leave it here and go. Embrace your new dimensions. Embrace the opportunities to learn and try new things because it will change your world. I embraced the opportunity to try saying yes to something and taking that trip to New York. And that was like I said, that was the catalyst for an epic year of transformation that has continued into years of transformation. A little bit slower, not quite as epic as that 1 year, but that was a year in a cocoon. And we may have several of those, and I've talked about holding cells and what those look like. And we may have several of those. Butterflies may only get one cocoon. We can get as many as we need to grow and prosper and flourish and embrace our new dimensions, those new dimensions that we've been stretched to. So honor your journey by staying grateful for the past lessons and experiences. Be mindful in the moment now, the moment and the person and the experience you're having now, and be grateful for it and be excited for what's next. And most importantly, how you can embrace this is to just keep going. Take those lessons and those things you've learned and go. Go forward with them. Go forward with imperfection. I have a mentor who frequently says done is better than perfect. Take the step. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you understand. I want to repeat that quote that inspired this one more time. I hope there was some piece of this that helped you, or maybe turned on a light bulb. That quote again was that a mind that is stretched by new experience can never go back to its old dimensions, by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Okay. Other quotes that are similar are "we can't go home again," or "when you know better, you do better." And those are absolutely true if you reflect a little bit on where you've been versus where you are, and the things that seem like tragedies at the time that may have catapulted that growth. I promise you'll be ready to embrace the growth and get out of that comfort zone a little bit more. So if you found this helpful, or you think someone else will, please share. Let me know if you've seen this. Let me know if you found it helpful. If you have a topic you'd like to see me cover in the near future, you guys know I love to learn. I love to branch into things I don't understand, learn a little bit more about them. Let me know. Shoot me a message. Drop a comment. And in the meantime, I hope the rest of your week is fabulous. I will see you next Wednesday. And most importantly, be well. Bye.